something I've talked about a lot, even though I have like addressed it before. The whole synthetic man thing. Because like usually when I talk about like AstroTurf YouTubers, I kind of like allude to the phenomenon. I talk about people like Asmongold or Mr. Beast or like, the biggest names in the industry that nobody actually watches, cares about, follows, thinks are cool, likes their content. These are just huge corporate YouTubers with huge financial backing, not because they're so successful, but because there's now an industry to prop up these kind of e-celebs. I've talked about this in the past before, and it's such an all-encompassing thing. It's just the nature of this industry now, right? It's not a bunch of independent people coming together and like producing amateur content. It has become increasingly corporate, right? It has become increasingly controlled. And I do believe to a certain extent that like basically every major YouTuber you've heard of essentially like falls under this umbrella. And one of the reasons why I almost exclusively talk about niche nobody YouTubers that nobody watches or cares about, people like Review Tech USA or Angry Joe or the Bit Block or what have you, is that they are actual people who don't seem to have these kind of associations. Well, I mean Angry Joe does, but like he's been around so long, he kind of grew into the role. But anyway, like obviously like there are nuances to this. There are always exceptions. There are always like people that need to be talked about or singled out for like whatever reason. So that people better understand like the current state of the gaming industry, the current state of the political landscape, and like the weird shift in culture. Because we have gone through another major cultural shift since the woke Gamergate era, right? We are in like that post woke era where like everyone hates it. It's been like rejected by everyone. And as a result of that, we're seeing a rise of these like contrarian content creators that are attempting to normalize degeneracy under the guise of conservatism, right? We saw this like a lot with like people like Nick Rekieta who were just like, oh man, I'm a hardcore Christian conservative. Oh, but like what he actually was a degenerate, like drug addicted, like sex fiend who just was having affairs and like visiting prostitutes and like all this crazy messed up stuff. Which, if it had been public at the height of his popularity, would have tanked him immediately. But because he was able to brush it under the rug for so long, he was able to build up a dedicated audience. But because of his inability to or unwillingness to hide his like real interests, because of his inability to work, what has happened is that his entire business model has just collapsed in and of itself. That's basically what happened to Rekieta, is that he larped as a conservative because he knew that's what would get him attention. That's what would get him clicks. That would get him. That would be what got him attention, money, like views. The entire anime community, his entire role in the Vic Mignogna saga was as this base Christian conservative lawyer, which of course is a complete and utter lie if we know anything about him. And that's just one example, right? That's just one notable example of like the kind of thing I'm talking about. People grifting LARPing as conservatives so that people who are concerned about like the decline in culture, society, government, education, employment, people who acknowledge the very real problems with society, yeah, just so they can take your money and do absolutely nothing about it. Like there are like dozens of examples of this. Whether it's Jeremy Hambley, like doing his thing, trying to sell like coffee so he can like stop like dick sucking Trump and like be more openly like pro LGBT and stuff like that. There's all these like real examples of this. Milo Yiannopoulos, being open homosexual, Nick Fuentes being a closet one. It's basically everywhere, and it's not necessarily because that like our side is inherently so fundamentally flawed, or because like there's some like glaring holes in the ideology. It is because that genuine people aren't willing to lie to their audience about what they believe, and as a result of that, like aren't going to get like ex- extreme amounts of support from the community, because a big chunk of what makes this grift work is telling people what they want to hear and not being genuine, not having a real debate, not having, any real idea on like what needs to be done or like how we need to grow and develop, not looking to the past but looking to the future, right? There's this the grift relies on bringing in as many people as possible under your banner and like just getting them to support your content and your cause while still maintaining your core values of being a degenerate and like supporting terrible life decisions, whether it's drug abuse or the LGBT community or what have you, right? What we're seeing, I think, is a pretty blatant example of that in the Synthetic Man. Someone who understood that all you had to do to find success on YouTube from 2018 to 2022 was just scream into a camera about how every Nintendo game was woke. We saw this with like Tears of the Kingdom came out, when he tried like going after that game and accusing it of like being satanic or whatever. It was obviously like so exaggerated and out of touch that no one could possibly take it seriously. But a lot of people on both the left and the right like did acknowledge that Synthetic Man was a grifter. Was someone who is like clearly exaggerating to get a rise of the community to really take advantage of the backlash towards the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Like trying to like normalize this, trying to justify the backlash towards this game, right? There was at the time this huge audience of people who hated Tears of the Kingdom, who wanted to see it fail, who wanted to undermine it, and like calling it woke was a very easy way to do that. Keep in mind, like with Baldur's Gate 3, which was a woke game, they kind of did the opposite and said that like, well, it's not that woke because you have freedom of choice to not engage with the woke, which is obviously a code, right? So you saw them do the same thing with like Disco Elysium, right? It's obviously a code, but like this is kind of what I talk about when I when I say that conservatism in a way is controlled opposition. Like they always steer you in the same direction, even though they purport themselves to have like completely different values and completely ideas. In the modern American political landscape, all roads lead to Israel, right? That's kind of the mindset I have going into this. And the mindset that we all should have going into this is that, like, I'm not simply satisfied with the conservative status quo. If anything, I consider, like, every major politician, every major business owner, um, every college student, everyone, like, in any reasonable position of authority, we should all consider them the enemy, because what have they done for anybody else? Are they educating young people? Are they like building up their businesses in a meaningful way? Are they taking care of their family? Like the answer is no. Like in pretty much all walks of life, like you just see a lot of abuse, a lot of neglect, a lot of like blaming other people, no taking responsibility for anything, right? And the Synthetic Man situation is a really good example of that in the YouTube space, because a lot of people aren't happy about the fact that Synthetic Man is obviously gay. Like that's the reality of it. Because this guy talks way too much about penises and about Rule 34, like Fuda specifically. Yeah, well, what specific? Yeah, he talks way too much about Fudanari to like ever really assume that this guy is completely 100% heterosexual, right? And upon being called out on it, like his reaction is to like demonize anime specifically, while like just it's just kind of it's really interesting, seeing like the backlash to this because I don't watch Synthetic Man. I've never watched Synthetic Man. I knew what he was like before I even like before this controversy even started cropping up. But like I find it really interesting how like there's a lot of very reoccurring themes when it comes to these people, right? How they reject Japanese culture, how they reject like certain American values, how they just kind of weasel their way out of like following through on like their stated convictions and stuff like that. How they immediately turn on their audience when they start getting called out for being so wishy-washy, right? Like this happens all the time with all of these people, right? How many like of these right-wing reactionaries from Gamergate like tried to call themselves like centrists, because like, well, I'm not that right-wing. It's like it's it's really interesting to see this play out again and again, and I really have to wonder at what point the general community is going to stop propping up these kind of nobody streamers and these kind of nobody content creators. I found myself kind of embarrassed, being associated with someone like Synthetic Man, right? I found myself thinking that this individual was a joke, probably long before the Tears of the Kingdom video. Like I found his takes embarrassing. I found him to be a try hard. Um, like I just think that this guy is just the defining example of everything wrong with the anti woke community. And that is something that we, as content creators, as consumers of other content creators, need to acknowledge is that like we need to start condemning people who pull stunts like this. You are not conservative. You are not some arbiter of truth. You are a grifter, and that's all you ever were. All you care about is getting clicks, getting money, getting attention, so you can build up your audience, just so you can tell them so you have the freedom to back off of those political opinions once you are financially secure enough. That is what we are seeing with the Synthetic Man right now.